And we also wanted to begin with the land acknowledgement. So although we are meeting online, I would like to acknowledge the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Indigenous communities that are native to the regions that the facilitators live in and in which we are learning today. I ask you to join me in acknowledging the Duwamish tribe, the Coast Salish, the Nisenan, the Tongva, and the Ohlone. Their elders, both past and present, as well as future generations. It is important for us to acknowledge the land which we are on because it is easier to deny Indigenous people their right if we historicize their struggles and simply pretend they don't exist. The struggle for Indigenous rights is also closely linked with the struggle for rights for all other people of color and needs to be a part of the conversation alongside Black Lives Matter. And these are our community agreements. If you guys have any other ones, you can feel free to put them in the chat. But yeah, we have one mic. So the space doesn't get too crowded. We ask that only one person speak at a time. And then right thought and right view. Always assume positive intent of other people who are speaking. Right speech. Remember that our words have power and can negatively impact others. Right action. What is shared here stays here, but what is learned here leaves here. So yeah, we hope that you all learned something from today and are able to leave here with it. And then the last one is right mindfulness. So create space and take space. Make sure you're not taking up too much space, but also if you're maybe not talking as much, you're always welcome to take up more space. So yeah, if you have any other ones, you can put them in the chat. And then yeah, so this is the third workshop in our current series. If you are interested, the slides for both workshop 1 and 2 are available on our website. And then the recording for workshop 2 is available on our new YouTube channel. And then today's slides and recordings will be available ASAP as well, so you can access these links. And then, as I mentioned, today's our third workshop, and we are following kind of the path of the Four Noble Truths. So today is the third one, which is how do we end suffering? And we will be looking at some possibilities for a future in which we don't actively create suffering for others. So yeah. The first topic we wanted to talk about is mutual aid. Mutual aid networks vary depending on the communities they serve, but in general, they are when people get together to meet each other's material needs, for example, foods, face masks, and delivering groceries to immunocompromised neighbors, or checking in on elderly community members. Mutual aid arises out of kinship, a love for our communities and the land we reside on, and a non-exclusionary focus on human and non-human relatives. Mutual aid projects are a form of political participation in which people take responsibility for caring for one another and changing political conditions by actually building new social relations that are more survivable. Mutual aid is different from charity in that charity is often a strategy for controlling poor people and upholds the system that makes most poor people for the benefit of the few. Mutual aid, on the other hand, comes with the understanding that it is the system, not the people suffering under it, that creates poverty, crisis, and vulnerability. Mutual aid includes the connection to and solidarity with other mutual aid projects and transformative work, as well as the commitment to dignity and self-determination of people in need or in crisis. Mutual aid is an intervention that rejects white supremacy and undermines the strength of racial capitalism, and is a key part of the framework for the abolishment of the prison industrial complex. This is because the act of sharing resources both changes our relationships, which capitalism dictates must be individualistic, and builds a new framework for how we survive and thrive in our communities. So here are a couple examples of mutual aid that I found. Since the start of the pandemic, especially, mutual aid networks have become more popularized and publicized. So if you go to this link, mutualaidhub.org, and search your location, you can find the mutual aid network which is closest to you. And then I wanted to include Indigenous mutual aid. which this link has like a lot of them listed, because mutual aid networks have been particularly important for Indigenous people, as COVID-19 has hit many tribes the hardest, and they often lack access to resources. And if anyone here is already part of a mutual aid network, we would love to hear about it. So feel free to write about your experiences in the chat or bring it up in the discussion.
Hi, I'm John. I'm sort of bringing up the rear here today with the presentation side. Thanks to Marissa and everybody for everything that you do. You know, we're going to be going through in the second part of the presentation a really dynamic and interesting and you know, really progressive set of approaches to the issues we've been talking about, you know, ways to sort of end suffering. At the same time, you know, I think as Buddhists, we know that suffering, it doesn't end kind of completely, right? Like we still face old age, sickness, death, and so on. But I think what we're talking about in our approach here is ways to reduce suffering, maybe that we have ourselves or that we inflict on others. And that's really what I think Marissa's talking about when she brings up mutual aid. So I just wanted to sort of share a quotation, if it's okay. I don't know if everyone here is Shin Buddhist, but if you'll join me in reflecting on these words, however you like. To realize an entrusting heart oneself and to guide others to it is the most difficult of all difficulties. To awaken beings everywhere to great compassion is truly to respond in gratitude to the Buddha's benevolence. And so this quotation is something that Shinran Shonin, the founder of Jodo Shinshu, said or wrote. And actually it was something he was reflecting on that someone before him wrote when he was thinking about the Buddha, when he was thinking about this kind of about life and the way that it works for us and what we give to life in return, you know. And so I don't have too much space on my one slide today to have a whole conversation about Shin Buddhist approaches to aid. But when I look at this quote, you know, when I look at the way that Shinran reflected on it, you know, kind of understanding he receives so much from life, you know, and you know, when you really recognize that, on a spiritual level, the truth of what we receive, then mutual aid is like a given. It's just something you naturally want to return out of gratitude for everything that we receive. So that's kind of one way that I think I look at mutual aid, and kind of ways that we can work to maybe not end all suffering everywhere, but to at least end the suffering that others experience, you know, in society, in their lives, through our actions or through our inactions, you know. And for me, this is actually very close to the heart of the way I perceive Shin Buddhism. Another way of looking at this is a quotation from Maya Angelou, and that is, "The truth is, no one of us can be free until everybody is free." And that's just another way that I think we can look at mutual aid and really start to ask ourselves, you know, what values we want to apply to these, you know, projects, these ideas. So like I said, we'll be going through that in the second part, but hopefully we can sort of establish a baseline for our approach by thinking about these kinds of values. I'll turn it back to Marissa.
Thank you, John. I also just wanted to talk a little bit about my perspective, I guess, from my Buddhist experiences. To me, the concept of mutual aid is extremely Buddhistic, and it fits in well with a lot of our concepts. For example, in Mahayana Buddhist traditions, compassion or karuna is one of the primary qualities that a practitioner should cultivate. Alongside with wisdom, it's a necessary requirement for progressing along the bodhisattva path, which seeks to liberate all sentient beings, like John mentioned. Yeah, so it is a universal compassion towards all sentient beings without exception, and it also comes with the inherent recognition of universal suffering. Although we know that and accept that there will be suffering in the world, no matter what we do. Like John also talked about, this is actually the point of genuine compassion. By recognizing the suffering of others and having a sincere and urgent desire to alleviate that suffering, we can learn to act compassionately in the world. We must try to really see and understand the suffering in the world and lean into our own discomfort in order to work towards alleviating the suffering of all sentient beings. Mutual aid presents a great opportunity for both understanding others' suffering and working towards alleviating that suffering. And then another concept I think ties in really well is dana, which is generosity, or selfless giving. So in Buddhism, it also refers to the practice of cultivating generosity. And I think this is pretty self-explanatory in its relation to mutual aid. But I think it's worth mentioning, however, that mutual aid networks are not about one-sided giving. When you participate in the mutual aid network, you gain new relationships and perspectives that are not possible under an individualistic capitalist approach. And then Sangha and community accountability. So Sangha means community, and it plays a key part of mutual aid networks. Mutual aid networks are local and sustained by communities, and our Sanghas have been practicing mutual aid for decades. One personal example is that all the Bashans and parents at Seattle Betson always feed me and the other college students, and give us rides and anything else we might need. And then in turn, we as young ministers' assistants give back by running children's services, giving Dharma talks, setting up the gym, and giving services at the nearby senior home. So I think at the very core of Sangha is reciprocal giving and dana, which is also the core of mutual aid. And then, so we wanted to talk kind of about values. So one of the most important questions that we have to consider while thinking about the future we want to see is, what values should we hold to ensure the future we want? Currently, our country is built on valuing profits over human lives and concepts of white supremacy and patriarchy. So as we go into our first discussion and throughout the rest of the workshop, we invite you to really sit back and think about what values you think are important and should be carried into the future. What I have come to understand is that capitalism has narrowed our way of thinking and limits our ability to be creative. I think that it is important to be positive and be as creative as possible in imagining the future and what we want our society to be. As we go through topics such as defunding the police and abolition in our second part, we invite you to consider these topics through the lens of your values and be open to new ideas. So yeah, we're going to head into our first discussion now. As we mentioned in our email, discussion is optional, but we encourage everyone to participate because I think that's how it will be the most beneficial for everyone. And then here are some discussion questions that we thought of, including what values do you think are important for us as a society to have? What does a future without suffering mean to you personally? And how does Buddhism inform your vision? But you guys can also talk about anything you found interesting or just want to discuss.
In a short amount of time, a lot came out of our group in our discussions of value. And actually, I'm saying I'm going to lead it, but Stephanie, is it okay if I ask you to talk? Yes, you. I'm going to ask you to talk a little bit about what came up in our group. Thank you.
Okay, I'm gonna do my best because I want to just like cover like really quickly like what everyone said in our group because it was so good. So like if anyone in our group wants to like jump in and just be like, actually I said this, like go for it. Yeah, we had a really great discussion. We kind of all like talked about at first like, you know, the question of like our workshop, like what it really poses, like what does a future without suffering really look like? And Wayne kind of like told us, you know, like because he, you know, like it had this like experience like 50, 60 years ago, like he can like see that like, you know, at the time, like what they had done, you know, like civil rights act, like things like that, like all those things, like they thought, you know, were going to be enough. And like now, like at the present day, you know, it's not. And like that's something like that he recognizes and that like we all like want to like address, knowing that like, you know, we think we might be doing the right thing, but sometimes like it just doesn't like come through that way. And like we have to like do better and like strive for that. And then okay, I'm trying to like look at the names here. And then Mia, okay, so Mia and Marissa, we all kind of like talked about like like what that really looks like in our communities, like what it looks like from our Sangha's perspective, like what we value as a Sangha and like how we like really perpetuate that to the communities like around us, so like outside of our Sangha, like where's the line between like what we value as a community, like I think Marissa brought up this example, like, building that new like gym or like building those like new rooms in our like community to like improve it, right? Where do we draw the line where we have to start helping people like outside of like, our own small community, but still technically our community? And then, Kayla got cut short. She's gonna start us off on our next one, hopefully. But we ended our discussion like talking about like values, and like John brought up this question, like, what do you think is that underlying value that we're going to talk about in this next session, the workshop, like what is really like pushing like all of our actions like in our society, and like where do we see that reflected in our Sangha? So that's like the brief summary, but it was such a good discussion. I'm like so happy that happened.
I agree. It was really great. And I think, that's the question, is how we apply it to these sort of actions that we're going to be looking at going forward. I think one other point too, I think that came up was, has the kind of capitalist economy, the individualistic attitude of the US or our egos really been challenged in that systemic way? And that's one thing we identified, that maybe, after civil rights actions, it wasn't really challenged. And so because of that, it just let ego and individual sort of capital take over slowly again. And then we saw the impact it's had, and so there's, certain things have been challenged and certain things have not been challenged from a values perspective. Is that fair to say? Okay. Marissa.
Thank you, John's group. It sounded like you guys had a really great discussion. Landon, do you want to go first for our group?
I'm just going to share something that I said because I don't think that I could recall everything that we talked about. But a couple people brought up like the idea of individuality versus like interconnectedness. And I guess that spoke to me because I think that our society is structured to be about like you can do things yourself and it's all about you and the work that you put in, but that doesn't necessarily overlap well with like the Buddhist idea of interconnectedness. So I think people, especially now with technology, it's really easy to focus just on the self and make it all about you, but the worse that gets, then I think the harder it is for people to have space for people that they don't see them fitting in the same box as them. So I guess I would hope that society could have a shift somehow, I don't know how that would work, to see that like have more boxes, so then you can say like, well, maybe that person's not 100% like me, but we share this and this, and then that could bring us together versus like, well, it's me versus them or me versus you. So that's all I can really remember.
Okay, Emily, do you want to share now?
Yeah, something that we also talked about was the theory of capitalism and its effect on our thinking in society. So like in capitalism, we think, oh, for someone to win, someone has to lose. And so that really affects the momentum that the Black Lives Matter movement the problems the Black Lives Matter movement is facing, because people are thinking, oh, for like Black Lives Matter to matter, other people have to be oppressed, or for defunding the police, some people think that other people will be affected negatively to achieve this goal of like a safer community. And going off of the idea of community that Landon was talking about, Allison brought up a really good point about like talking about how the sense of community really positively impacts the Sangha members. And I think that is like a feeling that we should expand towards not just our temple community, but also our neighborhoods and like the rest of people that like aren't exactly like us. Like we should be creating this helpful and supporting and community for everyone.
Great, thank you, everyone. I think we will take a short 5-minute break now before our second part. So yeah, we'll start again at 10:55. Thank you.
And we're really appreciative of everyone's contributions. And so as we move into this next section, there's going to be kind of a decent amount of presenting and information and sharing of ideas that we've seen kind of come out of the Black Lives Matter movement, connected movements, just things that have been tried, been trying to gain visibility for a long time in terms of approaches. So I think we just want to share them, and hopefully we can take our values discussion into this and think about, these approaches. So let me share if I can. All right. So one of the, there are many different approaches that have come out. I think that they're very intersectional. So we're going to sort of talk about them together. One of the phrases that we've heard, or that I've heard, been exposed to, is something called a third reconstruction. And this is building off of, historical legacy of attempting to reconstruct life in America for Black people following first slavery, and then 100 years later during the Civil Rights Movement, and, in some ways enshrining rights, and in many other ways not respecting those rights or working to undermine those rights. And so coming out of this movement, or actually this is a term that's been around since early, at least I think I've seen it at least 10 years ago, and it's called a third reconstruction. And the idea is, it must rekindle the aspiration of a nation, molded in the ideal of perfect equality, understanding that thinking big and going big too is the surest way toward a more perfect union. And so I think a lot of these ideas are really big. And it's really easy to look at it and go, okay, that's not going to happen, or we can't do that. But I just, hopefully we can think about it through this values perspective and think about what it would mean, how it might, some of these things could work to end suffering. And if we think that it will, if we think that having them in place increases suffering and ending them will end suffering, then I think that gives us a guide toward, what we want to work to. So first off, we wanted to talk about reparations, and I'm going to turn it back to Marissa for a minute here.
Yeah, thank you. So yeah, we wanted to talk a little bit about reparations. So I have a couple of links up here. I highly encourage you all to read the article, The Case for Reparations by Ta-Nehisi Coates. In it, he explains how virtually every institution with some degree of history in America, both public and private, has a history of extracting wealth and resources out of the African American community. And he also talks about how this is not just maltreatment or being mean, this is actually the theft of resources out of that community. And then the first link is for Asheville, North Carolina. So Asheville and Evanston, Illinois are both, they have both voted to give financial reparations to their Black communities. In Asheville, the money will not come in the form of direct payments, but rather as investments in areas where Black Americans still face discrimination and disparity in opportunity. And according to the bill, the money will go towards affordable housing, business and home ownership, career opportunities, and strategies to grow equity and generational wealth, closing the gaps in healthcare, education, employment, and pay, as well as neighborhood safety and fairness within criminal justice. And I also wanted to connect it back a little bit to the redress for Japanese Americans after World War II. Yeah, so under the Japanese American Claims Act of 1948, Japanese American families filed 26,568 claims, totaling $148 million in requests, but only about $37 million were approved and dispersed. Although reparations can't make up for psychological and other immaterial damages, I kind of question why we were able to get redress from the government so quickly, but I mean, relatively quickly, but descendants from slaves are still waiting on theirs, like after 450 years. Yeah, I think it's important that we support the Black community and advocate for reparations for them as well. So reparations, to me, involve not only material redress, but also a shift in our consciousness as a country. This ties back to our earlier discussion about values, because I think material redress won't mean anything unless we dismantle the fundamentally racist institutions and completely reimagine them.
All right. Back to me?
Yes.
Okay. All right. So another part of the discussion has been defunding the police. So I know we sort of laid the groundwork in the past two workshops for, you know, how things are working against Black communities. I just wanted to sort of remind us a little bit as we talk about defunding the police. I know the terminology can sometimes be controversial, but I think when we walk through what this history is and what the, you know, movement seeks to do, I think we might look at it a different way. So, you know, what we're really finding is that it is a myth that the law enforcement system is working as a whole to keep everyone safe, you know. And I think this myth is like perpetuated by the, you know, way that we look at cops and the law system in entertainment, news, and culture. I mean, just even looking to find a couple like photos to put in this presentation, I was overwhelmed by how many cop shows and law shows and, you know, bust the bad guy shows there are out there, you know. And so those are the types of myths that we have when we think about what the police are for and what they do. Police get the bad guys. Police always solve the case. They stop violent crimes. That's, you know, all these shows, everything you see on the news is murder, murder, murder. And that's what they're for, is to protect us, you know, law and order, crime and punishment, good and evil. But we've seen, this is part of what's come out of this movement, we've seen that this myth has been challenged by generations of oppressed communities, but only recently has, you know, the competing imagery of reality broken through. And that's the thing, you know, it's that imagery, it's the video, it's seeing it for ourselves that has broken through. You know, you maybe had pieces of it. You had the video, you know, 92, Rodney King, but you know, these last 10 years with smartphones, you see it in our lives, and you see that this kind of portrayal, this myth of the police state as it's presented, is just not reflective of reality. And so the other piece of that is that police reform movements have not reformed the police. You know, we kind of have this status quo where communities have a lack of investment in social welfare, degrading quality of life. The community reacts to that. And then the government reacts to that by enforcing, regulating communities through punishment and violence, and maybe until they're caught, you know, crossing the line, which they do regularly, but when they're caught, you know, then the calls for reform start coming out. So then, you know, we say, okay, we'll monitor police, we'll invest in their training, but they're going to continue the violent tactics, and we're still going to withhold community investment. And so that's kind of been this cycle that has sort of perpetuated this status quo. And I'm going to try and play a video that speaks to it better than me.
For years, reforms like introducing police body cameras have been proposed across the country as a response to police brutality. But these reforms have only added more money to police budgets, even when, as studies like this one in DC show, they have no detectable effect on police use of force.
We absolutely need to try and hold law enforcement accountable. But what we've recognized is all of our accountability measures up until now have not worked.
In the case of Minneapolis, since 2016, their police officers have received body cameras, bias training, and have a duty to intervene policy where other police officers must step in if they see force applied inappropriately. Yet, a Minneapolis police officer killed George Floyd as 3 officers looked on.
This idea that we can reform an institution that has a blue code of silence, that we can reform an institution that is one of the most powerful unions, that is no longer the conversation.
So what are the police doing? The police are really responsible for a lot more these days than solving violent crimes. Low-level offenses, drug bust, misdemeanors, pulling people over, these types of infractions constitute 80% of police work, and arrests for violent offenses constitute 5% of police work. Black people represent 12% of the population and yet are almost a third of all arrests. So part of their job is to regulate Black people and Black communities. Our schools have many, many police. 1.7 million schools have police, but they have no counseling. 3 million have police, but no nurses. And another huge part of police presence is responding to mental health crises, mental health related calls. And that actually represents 1 in 4 police shooting deaths. So, this is something that the police understand themselves.
In many cases, police officers are the first responders to mental health related emergencies. That's important because 1 in every 4 deaths from police shootings are people with mental health problems.
I could literally imagine you just replace someone with a weapon, someone who will actually sit down on the ground with them and talk, not throw them on the ground and sit on top of them or lay on top of them, but someone who will take them wherever they are, listen to their situations, and then try to figure out, diagnose their problem.
Police are doing the jobs of what other groups of people and workers can be doing.
Being tasked with jobs they're not trained to do is an idea some police officers acknowledge too.
Every societal failure, we put it off on the cops to solve. Not enough mental health funding. Let the cop handle it. Not enough drug addiction funding. Let's give it to the cops. Schools fail. Give it to the cops. Policing was never meant to solve all those problems.
The need to rethink police budgets has become even more glaring in the middle of the coronavirus pandemic. Many have called attention to the fact that hospital workers struggle to get personal protective equipment, while thousands of police officers have riot gear at the ready for protests.
So in light of all of this, when we think about defunding the police now, when we think about what they're kind of doing, what the impact is that they're having, and the fact that it seems even them or members among them realize that they're doing more than they think they should be doing, how do we change that? And so the big idea is to change how America allocates the $100 billion that's spent on policing and $80 billion that's spent on incarceration funding annually. It's moving our money away from harmful policing activities and investing in human-centered services that actually make our communities safer, help our communities thrive. And I think in the terms we've been discussing today, it's just recognizing suffering that's out there and working to end it with nonviolent services and actions instead of increasing suffering through violent punishment. And I'll have one more clip here.
So America spends $100 billion on policing and another $80 billion on incarceration, where Black people are disproportionately targeted. What if we used our tax money to put towards other services like education, like healthcare, like housing, like employment opportunities? In some cities, just by defunding the police by 5% would double the budget for public health. No school. It's actually happening. It's happening in cities all across the country, all over the country. People are asking the question, do we really need to invest all of these funds in a system that doesn't work while we're taking funds away from systems that do work, that will help? So what does that look like? That looks like divest in police and schools, invest in teachers and counseling. That looks like divesting and criminalizing mental health and providing mental health and restorative services. That means divesting in an over-militarized police force, military weapons against citizens, and investing in community-led harm reduction programs. That's it. That's it. That's the whole thing.
So that's it. that's, that's the movement to defund the police. And I think, again, in light of what history we can see, it's a very, very valid movement. And the good news is we are actually already starting to see traction. The LA City Council voted this month to cut $150 million from their police budget, $3 billion annual budget. And the mayor is actually, committed to reinvesting those funds in communities. They've also are looking to replace the LAPD. I don't know about that, but that's explorations that are supposedly being made, and reorienting it toward community-based, and at least adding unarmed emergency responders for nonviolent calls. I think we may have seen in Minneapolis, their city council committed to abolishing the police department and completely reconstructing it along community-based nonviolent lines. It's a lot of work ahead, but I think, just seeing these movements so far on a local level shows that it can be done, that these steps can really work to recognize and end suffering. And if you don't mind, I'm going to just walk us through. So these are kind of movements that are happening on a local level. But recently, an act was introduced on a federal level. And this is actually for a new federal civil rights bill. This was created by the Movement for Black Lives, which is actually a consortium of many different communities, organizations. And this act is supported by Representatives Ayanna Pressley and Rashida Tlaib. So this BREATHE Act is really, really progressive. It's separated into 4 different sections, and it outlines very specific ways to return resources and funds to communities and to reduce the harms that have been brought on by our historically racist, criminal, legal, economic, and political systems. And so the way that one reporter summarized it is, this legislation aims to codify that which is not yet ingrained in our culture, which is respect and dignity for Black people. So I'm just going to walk you through these 4 parts. So this is, like I said, it's a federal bill, and the aims of this bill are really, really wide-reaching. And if this is something that could be passed, it would be really amazing. The people who created this bill said, we are not going to stand by and kind of accept what is politically feasible. We are going to ask for what is just. So in their view, the first thing that needs to happen to restore justice is to divest federal resources from incarceration and policing, and to end criminal legal system harm. And so this bill is calling to close federal prisons, to close immigration detention centers, to abolish immigration and the DEA, to ban military-grade weapons and surveillance tactics from police departments, to end civil asset forfeiture, to decriminalize and expunge drug offenses, to abolish mandatory minimum sentences, life sentences, and the 3 strikes law. Major, major changes. What they also want to do is they want to utilize funding incentives to invest in new approaches to community safety. So they want to make grants to local jurisdictions and sort of encourage them to decarcerate their jails, to defund their police forces. So this is, like I said, a federal act. So they want to give these grants to have communities remove police, armed security, metal detectors, and all of this kind of surveillance equipment from schools or other government offices that provide social services. They want to eliminate all these fees and these surcharges within the criminal legal system and forgive outstanding court debt, which disproportionately affects Black women. They want park redevelopment investments, streetlight investments, infrastructure investments. And I think another critical point is to revise the 911 call processing system so that it reduces unnecessary contact between law enforcement and community members. And so I think one way we talked about that was, in these mental health service calls, I think there are communities that are working on different approaches where, it is actually where a call that comes in for a mental health crisis is addressed differently. They don't just send a cop out with a gun, they send out a mental health service professional, and maybe they have a cop there who does not have a gun. I'm sorry, I can't remember the city that's doing that right now, but I just read something about this. Thirdly, they want to allocate new money. So the previous one was sort of incentives, but this is new money that they want to allocate to build healthy, sustainable, and equitable communities for all people. You know, a lot of these have been talked about: paid family and sick leave, guaranteed living wage, the right for workers to organize, protections for underregulated industries like domestic workers and farm workers. You know, oftentimes other workers who are paid below minimum wage and expected to make money off of tips. We need to increase environmental quality, safe drinking water, clean drinking water, breathable air, sustainable energy sources, and climate change protection. So think of what happened in New Orleans, and you know how the community was not protected or ready for the impact of climate change. Ensuring convenient access to healthy food sources, expanding Medicaid and other health services and providing them free at local community centers, expanding affordable housing and assistance for people to get into that affordable housing, and full and free access to a lifetime education. So anyone with debt understands that last one. And then lastly, the BREATHE Act hopes to hold officials accountable and to enhance self-determination of Black communities. So Marissa brought up the reparations, and so there's actually a bill that's been out there for a while, and this is just to have a commission to study reparations proposals, and that hasn't been able to get passed. So this would be part of that bill to pass that act. There will also be commissions on reparations for the impact of mass criminalization and violations, long-standing violations of treaty obligations to tribal nations. It would guarantee people the right to recover damages when federal officials commit constitutional violations. We've been seeing a lot of constitutional violations lately in protests and the way that the government's responded to those protests. Public financing of campaigns supported by small contributions, you know, to lift local voices, to lift community voices into positions of representation. And then lastly, to ensure fair voting processes that are free from racial discrimination. So these are 4 huge, you know, really broad areas for the BREATHE Act. They have a lot more specifics to these proposals that I just didn't bullet point here. But if you go to breatheact.org, you'll see it. And I think it's a really great bill. And I think it is a great place to start thinking about true, you know, third Reconstruction, true investment. And then I think lastly, I just wanted to dig a little bit more into secure voting because I feel like that's a really big issue right now. I think it's something where, you know, very specific actions can and have been taken and then been clawed back over time. And so, you know, during the first Reconstruction, you know, post-slavery, the right to vote, you know, was given to everybody. Well, at least it was given to former slaves, and the right to vote was not to be denied to those people. But very shortly after, you know, maybe 10 or 20 years, those voting rights were suppressed through enactment of very blatant segregationist laws, you know, known as Jim Crow. So then the second Reconstruction came along, and this Voting Rights Act of 1965 was a lot better, right? It banned very specific practices of discrimination, and very importantly, it required federal pre-clearance of voting laws in states with histories of voter suppression. And so what that means is if you were very, you know, it was, I shouldn't say, I think it was mostly states, you know, in the South, definitely Texas, definitely Florida. You know, if you had that history of voter suppression, you couldn't just make a law and it could maybe, you know, discriminate against someone. They had to go through the courts to prove it. You had to ask before you made the law, and you had to actually prove that it did not discriminate. Unfortunately, the Supreme Court struck down that Pre-Clearance Act in 2013. And so states since then have expanded numerous voter suppression tactics. I mean, it was so quick and so blatant. It's kind of amazing, but it's terrible. And so I'll show you this clip, but so Reverend Barber, who actually coined this third Reconstruction title, he called the old laws the Jim Crow laws, and he calls the new things the James Crow Esquire laws. And what he's saying is, that's this kind of like lawyerly way of suppressing the vote. Maybe it's not as blatant, but it still has the same effect.
1870, the Constitution was amended with the 15th Amendment. No state can deny or abridge the right to vote. Jim Crow was straight out trying to deny. These new tactics, which some call Jim Crow, some call it James Crow Esquire, are attempts to abridge, to put impediments in the way of people participating in the fullness of this democracy. That is unconstitutional. Jim Crow would just blatantly vote. Jim Crow said, read the Constitution backwards. Jim Crow says, how many bubbles in a bar of soap? Jim Crow says, is your grandfather slave? James Crow Esquire comes along in a suit, gets a computer, goes in the back room, and very slyly uses a computer model and uses the geographic information on race to divide and undermine not only Black power, but the power of fusion politics. That's why on February the 9th, we're having a massive people's vote. We do it every year. Thousands of people going to the legislature. We're focusing on the poor, but we're saying that if you're going to address poverty and economic justice, you've got to have fair and equitable voting rights, because that's the only place of balance. Poor people can't compete with the rich lobbyists. So they have to have access to the ballot in order to shape the balance of power.
So what do voting rights mean under the third Reconstruction? Well, if you look on the left column, basically these are all actions that suppress access to the vote. And by the way, I don't know if you noticed, but that video was made in 2013. It was actually just after the Supreme Court made that ruling. So it's actually been 7 years since that point, since the way he was discussing this issue has actually been a lot worse for actions that states have taken. And so, actions to suppress access, like I said, so now the burden's on the voters to prove that a law discriminates. There's voter ID requirements. There's voter roll purges where they just take names off, oftentimes inaccurately. There's early deadlines to register, which, sometimes can be a couple months before the election. So if you're not paying attention, then you miss out. There's, vote by mail is a big issue right now during the coronavirus. Some states are trying to expand it, others are not. It would be the easiest and safest way for people to vote would be by vote by mail. And in California, as you may know, we're all going to get a ballot. But in a lot of other states, they don't want to do that because that would empower people to vote who they don't want to vote. So a lot of states, even aside from the coronavirus, have major restrictions on who's allowed to vote by mail. There's mixed restrictions by state on felon voting. Some states, there's only 2 states that actually allow felons to vote while they're still in prison, Maine and Vermont. Most states have, a certain path to restoration of rights post either once they are out of jail or maybe once they finish their sentence. And there's still 11 states, mostly in the South, that require a much more difficult process to try and restore felon voting rights. Or sometimes they're just suspended indefinitely. Election day only voting is another thing that disproportionately affects minority communities. Basically, if you're only allowed to vote during the day and you work a job and you can't get there, then it's a problem. And it's even compounded worse when you have fewer polling places, meaning you have to wait hours and hours and hours in line. Another area that's a problem are partisan registrars and redistricting. So if you have one party sort of controlling the way that people vote or controlling the way that districts are drawn for voting, then you're going to see their interests reflected in that. So on the right column, you see there are lots of actions that promote access. You may have heard of the John Lewis Voting Rights Act of 2020. So the aim of that act is simply to restore that pre-clearance requirement that I mentioned earlier. So that's to put the burden on governments that have historically discriminated during voting to prove that if they make a law, it does not discriminate. Instead of voter ID, signature attestation, which has been the norm basically since voting began here, is a way to ensure that everyone has the right to vote. And a lot of these other things are things that we should be looking for: automatic registration, on-site registration, voting by mail for all, auto restoration of rights or not suspending rights for people who are in prison, early voting, voting holiday, more polling places, using data to drive when you, if you have a certain density of people, then there should be a certain number of polling places so they don't have to wait 8 hours. And then, moving voter registration and redistricting to nonpartisan environments. And in California, they actually did that. So the district lines are drawn by a nonpartisan committee, and they look to reflect the actual composition of neighborhoods in the way that they draw districts. So those are just some of the ways that we can look at voting rights under this third Reconstruction. And I think it's, really important to focus on because it's votes coming. So I'm sorry, I know I kind of ran through everything, like I said, but I'm going to turn it back over to Marissa from here.
Thank you, John. I'm going to share my screen again. Sorry, gotta catch up. Okay. So I guess before I jump in again, I wanted to just check in with everyone and remind everyone of our earlier discussion about values and mutual aid, and invite you to think about all of those concepts that we talked about again, like while we're going through all of these ideas. So yeah. I wanted to talk about restorative justice a little bit. Restorative justice is a philosophy and a social movement which provides an entirely different way of thinking about crime and victimization. Our current retributive justice system focuses on punishment, regarding the state as the primary victim of criminal acts and casting victims and prisoners in passive roles. Restorative justice, by contrast, focuses on healing and rehabilitation. It incorporates a strong human rights analysis that emphasizes the factors of race and class in the over-incarceration of people. It assumes that the persons most affected by crime, victims and offenders, should have the opportunity to become involved in resolving the conflict. The goals of restoring losses, allowing prisoners to take responsibility for their actions, and helping victims move beyond their sense of vulnerability stand in sharp contrast to the conventional focus on past criminal behavior and increasing levels of punishment. So more specifically, restorative justice is an approach to justice in which one of the responses to a crime is to organize a meeting between the victim and the offender, sometimes with representatives of the wider community. The goal is for them to share their experience of what happened, to discuss who was harmed by the crime and how, and to create a consensus for what the offender can do to repair the harm from the offense. This may include a payment of money given from the offender to the victim, apologies and other amends and other actions to compensate those affected and to prevent the offender from causing future harm. I know this is probably like the part of restorative justice that most people have questions about or like are worried about, but yeah, I'm not an expert on restorative justice. Yeah. So another definition of restorative justice that I found was a growing social movement to institutionalize peaceful approaches to harm, problem solving, and violations of legal and human rights. These range from international peacemaking tribunals such as the South Africa Truth and Reconciliation Commission to innovations within the criminal and juvenile justice systems, schools, social services, and communities. Rather than privileging the law, professionals and the state, restorative resolutions engage those who are harmed, wrongdoers, and their affected communities in search of solutions that promote repair, reconciliation, and the rebuilding of relationships. Restorative justice seeks to build partnerships to reestablish mutual responsibility for constructive responses to wrongdoing within our communities. Restorative justice approaches seek a balanced approach to the needs of the victim, wrongdoer, and community through processes that preserve the safety and dignity of all. A restorative justice program aims to get offenders to take responsibility for their actions, to understand the harm they have caused, to give them an opportunity to redeem themselves, and to discourage them from causing further harm. For victims, its goal is to give them the active role in the process and to reduce feelings of anxiety and powerlessness. Restorative justice is founded on an alternative theory to the traditional methods of justice, which often focuses on retribution. However, restorative justice programs can complement traditional methods. Restorative justice is tied to prison abolition because prison abolition not only calls for the eradication of cages, but also new perspectives and methodologies for conceptualizing crime, an aim that is shared by restorative justice. In an abolitionist style of restorative justice, participation is voluntary and not limited by the requirements of organizations or professionals. The process includes all relevant stakeholders and is mediated by an independent third party. So yeah, the emphasis is on meeting the needs of and strengthening the community. And that leads into prison abolitionism. So just to explain prison abolitionism really quickly, it's a movement of a loose collection of people and groups who in many different ways are calling for deep structural reforms to how we both handle and even think about crime in our country. Abolitionists believe that incarceration in any form harms society more than it helps. As Angela Davis argues, prisons are an obsolete institution because they exacerbate societal harms instead of fixing them. She says, are we willing to relegate ever larger numbers of people from racially oppressed communities to an isolated existence marked by authoritarian regimes, violence, disease, and technologies of seclusion that produce severe mental instability? Moreover, Davis contends, mass imprisonment reproduces the very conditions that lead people to prison. And I wanted to watch her video really quickly.
You know, those who want to abolish prisons, I don't think they may not have the same understanding of the issues that perhaps you would in the way you present it. So your position on it is what?
Well, yes, I am. I identify as a prison abolitionist. And those of us who are a part of what we call the 21st century abolition movement want to see the issues that prisons attempt to address but cannot. We want to see those issues dealt with differently and more effectively. I mean, for example, violence against women. If we simply incarcerate every man or woman who commits an act of violence against women, that doesn't necessarily mean that the problem goes away. What it means is we have ever more people behind bars.
I think it's partly that it's the will of the people in a sense that we live in a punishment society. People want their pound of flesh. And oftentimes they're not worried about recidivism. They're not worried about rehabilitation. It's that particular individual who's convicted of a crime needs to pay their debt to society. We're conditioned to hear about their debt to society. And so you have a culture of people that are interested in seeing the bad person go to jail. And doesn't that also feed into the problem?
Most people, including myself, I have to catch myself sometimes, when someone does something bad to me, the first instinct is to figure out how to get back at that person. Right. So, how do we imagine justice in a very different context? Justice that's not based on vengeance, but justice that's made on repairing the relationships that are damaged through harm.
It's a long-term plan, obviously.
Very long-term plan. Very long-term plan.
And you think about it, it wasn't that long ago when, segregation was a reality. It wasn't that long ago when a student gets killed because he integrates a school. This is in most people who are watching their lifetime. Do you look at this like 20, 40, 50, 60 years? Is this a century long of constantly changing attitudes?
I often point out that when I was young, growing up in Birmingham, Alabama, and I used to sometimes get very upset that as a Black child, I couldn't do what I wanted to do. I couldn't go to the amusement park. I couldn't go to the big library. We had to go to this sort of rundown Black library. Mm-hmm. And, my mother was always very careful to tell me that this is not the way things were supposed to be. She said, this is not the way things are supposed to be, and they will change. So she allowed me to develop the capacity to imagine the future in a way that sometimes seems very radical. But it seemed radical during the era of slavery. And so today, of course, slavery, even though we think we've abolished it, we haven't. But still, in terms of the way people think about it, it's seen as horrendous, atrocious.
So yeah, that was Angela Davis. Another thing I wanted to add is that abolitionists don't stop at the prison walls. However, they aim to reshape our society as a whole. They say that we're not doing nearly enough to address the root causes of poverty, addiction, homelessness, and mental health crises. Abolitionists contend criminalizing poverty through harsh fines and debt regulation, criminalizing addiction through drug laws, criminalizing homelessness by conducting sweeps of people sleeping in parks, and criminalizing mental illness by turning prisons into de facto psychiatric hospitals is all treating the symptom instead of the disease. This is one of the key differences between reform and abolitionism. The former deals with pain management, and the latter deals with the actual source of the pain. Abolitionists therefore share an idea or a vision more than a structure, a future in which vital needs like housing, education, healthcare, etc. are met, allowing people to live safe and fulfilled lives without the need for prisons. And then the last thing I wanted to add is that abolition should center the leadership of Black and Indigenous people, immigrants, and transgender/gender nonconforming people to end systems of harm, control, and violence, which are prisons, policing, the criminal legal system, immigrant enforcement, and surveillance, and instead build up practices, systems, and values that keep our communities and planet safe, healthy, and free. It's also important to listen to incarcerated voices, which is why I recommend reading In the Belly. The link is right here, which is a journal collection of writing from incarcerated workers. And I also recommend reading Angela Davis's book, Are Prisons Obsolete? So AAPI abolition is it was created as a response to 8 Can't Wait, which offered a set of 8 reforms they claimed would reduce police killings by 72%. However, the police and prison abolitionists believe that this campaign is dangerous and irresponsible, offering a state of reforms that have already been tried and failed, mislead a public newly invigorated to the possibilities of police and prison abolition and that do not reflect the needs of criminalized communities. They refuse to allow the blatant co-optation of decades of abolitionist organizing towards reformist ends that erase the work of Black feminist theorists. As the group says, abolition can't wait. So this graphic has all 8 of their steps, and I just kind of wanted to go a little bit into each one. So the first one is defund the police. They say to reject any proposed expansion to police budgets, demand the highest budget cuts per year until they slash the police budget to 0, require police, not cities, to be liable for misconduct and violent settlements, ban police contracting for nonprofits and institutions, reduce the power of police unions, abolish asset forfeiture programs and laws, deplatform white supremacist public officials, prohibit private-public innovation schemes that profit from temporary technological fixes to systemic problems of police abuse and violence. These contracts and data-sharing arrangements, however profitable for technologists and reformists, are lethal. The second one is demilitarize communities. So demilitarize communities means disarm law enforcement officers, including the police and private security, remove cops from hospitals, end the militarization of Black and brown neighborhoods by ending broken windows policing, precision policing, community policing, and all iterations of quality of life police programs, such as neighborhood policing, gang policing, and repeat offender policing, etc. Surveillance technologies are weapons in the hands of law enforcement, and police, military, and immigration enforcement prohibit training exchanges between U.S. law enforcement and global military and policing entities. These relationships circulate deadly techniques and technologies, exporting the American model of racist policing worldwide, and also repeal all laws that hide, excuse, or enable police misconduct. The third one is remove police from schools. Removing police, both public and private, from all schools, calling on universities to dissolve relationships with police departments, prohibiting police departments from using city contracts with the universities to do IRB-exempt data analysis, geographic and community profiling, human-computer amelioration studies, and predictive analytics. Instead, divert funds to public service-related studies and community collaborations. Remove surveillance tech and metal detectors from all schools, and school zero tolerance disciplinary policies, which I talked about a little bit last week, and the use of carceral-like punishment of students, including suspensions and expulsions that disproportionately target Black and brown students, especially Black girls. Urge states to repeal truancy laws, prohibit the surveillance of Black and brown students by their teachers, counselors, and school officials through programs that criminalize student and exploit relationships of trust with school officials, including countering violent extremism / targeting violence and terrorism prevention. The fourth one is free people from prisons and jails. So this includes permanently closing all local jails, pressuring state legislators to end mandatory arrest, and failure to protect laws that lead to the criminalization of survivors of gendered violence. Reject alternatives to incarceration that are carceral in nature, including the problem-solving courts and electronic monitoring and coercive restorative justice programs. Reducing jail term by reducing arrests, freeing all people from involuntary confinement, including but not limited to jails, prisons, immigration detention centers, psychiatric wards, and nursing homes, starting with vulnerable populations such as those who are aging, disabled, immunocompromised, held on bail, held for parole violations, and survivors. Cutting funding to prosecutor offices, ending pre-trial detention, ending civil commitment, releasing all people held on pre-trial and on parole violations, making all communication to and from prisoners free, ending immigration detention, ending family separation, and letting our undocumented community members come home. Number 5 is repealing laws criminalizing survival. So repeat local ordinances that criminalize people involved in the sex trade, drug trades, and street economies, calling on mayors to grant clemencies to criminalize survivors of violence, repealing local ordinances that criminalize the occupation of public spaces, particularly for people experiencing homelessness, repealing statutes that criminalize survivors of gendered violence, including mandatory arrest and failure to protect laws. On the road to completing decriminalization, immediately decriminalize all misdemeanor offenses, which currently account for 80% of total court dockets, ending all fine and fees associated with the criminal legal processes, including ticketing, cash bail, court costs, and parole and probation fees. Number 6 is investing in community self-governance. So this includes promoting neighborhood councils as representative bodies within municipal decision-making, investing in multilingual resources for immigrant and asylum-seeking communities, assessing community needs and investing in community-based resources, including groups from tenant unions to local shop owners and street vendors, prioritizing those from marginalized groups, and investing in community-based public safety approaches, including non-carceral violence prevention and intervention programs, and skills-based education on bystander intervention, consent and boundaries, and healthy relationships. Number 7 is providing safe housing for everyone. This includes canceling rent without the burden of repayment, especially during COVID-19, repurposing empty buildings, houses, apartments, and hotels to house people experiencing homelessness, prohibiting evictions, providing unequivocal support and resources to refugee and asylum-seeking communities, allowing community benefits agreements to be a community government means of urban planning, making public housing accessible to everyone, repealing discriminatory laws barring people from accessing resources based on income, race, gender, sexuality, immigration status, or history of incarceration, supporting and promoting the existence of community land trusts for Black and historically displaced communities, removing COPs from all re-entry and shelter institutions, ensuring that survivors of gendered violence have access to alternative housing options in the event that their primary housing becomes unsafe, providing non-coercive housing options for young people experiencing abuse or family rejection of their queer or trans identities. And finally, the 8th one is invest in care, not COPs. So this includes allocating city funding towards healthcare infrastructure, including non-coercive mental health care, wellness resources, neighborhood-based trauma centers, non-coercive drug and alcohol treatment programming, peer support networks, and training for healthcare professionals. Make these services available for free to low-income residents, adopt a care not COPs model, invest in teachers and counselors, universal childcare and support for all family structures, free and accessible public transit, ending the use of property taxes to determine school funding, install safe and sanitary gender-inclusive public restrooms, ensure investment in community-based food banks, grocery cooperatives, gardens, and farms, and ensuring free and more extensive public transport, especially servicing the marginalized and lower income communities. And then lastly, invest in youth programs that promote learning, safety, and community care. So these are some common questions about abolitionism. We're kind of running out of time, so I'm not going to go too in-depth, but if you want to read his more in-depth answers, you can go, I have the link in our next step slides. But yeah, if you have any questions about abolitionism, Dean Spade is a great resource. And then I wanted to end this part with a quote that I found by Alexis Pauline Gumbs. She says, "What if abolition isn't a shattering thing, not a crashing thing, not a wrecking ball event? What if abolition is something that sprouts out of the wet places in our eyes, the broken places in our skin, the waiting places in our palms, the tremble holding in my mouth when I turn to you? What if abolition is something that grows? What if abolishing the prison industrial complex is the fruit of our diligent gardening, building, and deepening of a movement to respond to the violence of the state and the violence in our communities with sustainable, transformative love?" So yeah, I just wanted to remind everyone that even though it may seem bleak, sometimes abolition and all of these kinds of ideas are inherently positive, and yeah, our future is positive. So that we can go into our discussion. We are kind of running out of time, so we might do a whole group discussion. I'm not sure. What do you think, John?
Sorry, we've been chatting with each other the last minute trying to decide how to do it, because we realized that, and really appreciate taking the time to listen to us today. We wanted to present a lot of ideas, and we did, but it's also we did also want to get out around noon or so we don't want to keep you too far past that. So what we were thinking is, instead, can we maybe sorry, we're still talking about what we're going to do. We were thinking maybe we would just keep it as a large group discussion, and for me to stop talking, because to see what other people think. Okay, I'm going to stop talking.
Yeah, so if everyone feels comfortable, I think we're going to do a large group discussion, and I'm going to stop recording.
Like, it was really like successful in terms of like people really being willing to share their experiences and like be really open-minded to like what everyone else has to say. And these are just some like next steps and resources that we want to like share with you. Our hope is that you come to this workshop to learn and to discuss, and that you can take what at least like one or two things like at least from this workshop and like really bring it into your own lives and your conversations with others. Always continue to read and learn about these topics, think critically, like educate yourself as much as possible. And then we want to point out that you should always make sure to pay the IPOC for their labor, although many resources are available for free. They did make those for you, and you know, it's always important that they receive like what they deserve. Feel free to look back on any of the resources throughout our presentation. We will be uploading this presentation to our workshop page, and we will be sending out an email to you guys to thank you all for coming again. And yeah, you can also click on those links when you get the PowerPoint. I just sent you a link in the chat. It's also right here. Oh, this actually isn't the feedback form thing, but it's our youngbuddhisteditorial.com/workshop-feedback. And there's just like 10 really quick, like multiple choice type questions that are like, that would really help us like figure out how best to proceed with our workshops and make them better for you and for the rest of our community. So thank you so much again. Our next workshop will be in 2 weeks. We'll be like taking this discussion like one step further. So we hope to all see you there.
Thank you again, everyone, for coming.
Thank you.
Yeah.